People who clean up crime scenes, what's the most bizarre thing you've witnessed? Story 1. I used to do CSI work and was an autopsy tech, so I would go to the scene, investigate, bring the body back to the morgue, and help with the autopsy. Anyway, this person ended their spouse, stuffed the body into a fridge, and buried it in the woods. When you have a body exposed to the elements, you have a quote-unquote normal putrefaction to look forward to. Once you've seen a few, you'll know that this kind of state of the body is normal and you know what to expect. There are varying levels of stuff you deal with, but it's all within the expected spectrum of the job. I hope that makes sense. However, in this case, this person was sealed in, so you didn't have any of that. They were essentially stewing in there for almost a year, might have been longer, I don't remember the exact time. I wasn't there on scene when they found the person, only in the morgue to help with the autopsy. So I prep the room, the doctor comes in, and I pull out the body from the fridge and wheel them into where we do the actual autopsy. I open the bag, and oh my God, the smell? I'll never, ever forget the smell. I've dealt with bodies in various stages of death and putrefaction, but holy crap, this was a 10 on other levels. Now, the morgue has HVAC, air filters, fresheners, and all of that, but they weren't effective at all for the smell. It was so bad that I gagged, which I've never done before, and almost threw up in my mask. The doctor was struggling too. The doctor double-backed and almost looked like they were going to faint. It was the purest, worst, most concentrated, extremely pungent ammonia smell you could think of. I'd never smelled anything like that in my career at that point. If wine ages well and is better with time, this ammonia smell did the exact opposite, and it was somewhere worse than anything you could think of. The smell stuck to us too, on our skin, for about a week, no matter how hard I scrubbed. I can still smell it if I think about it. The texture of the body didn't help either. It was so slippery and wet that flecks of the ammonia fluid splashed onto my skin. The long gloves went up to my forearm, not to my scrubs. It was the worst autopsy of my life. It took about 3 hours too because we kept having to take breaks and it was a difficult body to work on due to how fragile it was. It beat out everything else I saw, from the crazy accident fatalities to the interesting self-inflicted injuries to even the person who had disfiguration due to animal consumption. Story 2. Crime scene cleaner here. My first cleanup was quite an experience. A man ended himself in his garage, and I'll never forget needing to use pliers to pull fragments out of the drywall behind where he sat, or other things managing to make their way more than 50 feet across the garage. Most disturbing, though, was his pickup. We chose to take it out to our company wash bay to pressure wash it and make sure it was as clean as possible. I cleaned it myself and was satisfied that I had done pretty well. I inspected it for hemoglobin and couldn't find anything, so I began driving it back to the owner's garage. On the way back, a slight drizzle began and I switched on the wiper blades. Imagine my horror as something weird streaks across my newly cleaned windshield. I pulled over quickly and cleaned it up, but it still makes me sick to think about what could have happened if it hadn't rained that day. This poor man's wife or daughter would have been met with that sight and crushed again by the impact of what he had done. Now that was 10 years ago and I'll still never forget it. Now I triple or quadruple check every job. Ugh, just hearing this makes me physically sick. I wonder how this dude copes with his work. Story 3. I don't clean up crime scenes, but I do remove the deceased. I can get into more accurate details about the deceased, but here's some general stuff. Hoarders are a lot more common than they really should be, first of all. And it's never a clean hoard. It's piles of junk covered in several types of crap and more. I understand when the emergency services don't want to be in that kind of house longer than they have to, but I'll never forget having to ask them to help me because I couldn't distinguish between what was actually the deceased and what was just a pile of random stuff that looked more human than the deceased did. People will warn you that your bodies will bloat and touching them the wrong way will make them leak, but the image you conjure up doesn't even shed light on what it can actually be like. Story 4. Firefighter EMT here. I once responded to a call for self-inflicted harm with a rifle. He was gone, nothing for us to do there but pronounce. Cops cover the body and then want to escort the family out of the scene because everyone is processed like a crime scene regardless, and it is the only way in or out of the property. Before they do so, though, my partner had to point out a human body part that was still remarkably intact just sitting in the tree over his body. Another one just came to mind. A drunk driver hit a tree, wasn't wearing his seatbelt, and was ejected. Well, most of him anyway. One of only 2 traumatic amputations of major limbs I've seen survive. We were called to return to the scene after delivering him to the hospital because the cops didn't know what to do with it. And before anyone asks, no, there was no chance of reattachment. The challenge was figuring out how to get it out of the car it was trapped in. Don't drive hammered, boys and girls, and for crying out loud, wear your goddamn seatbelts. And all the morons going, I'd rather be thrown clear, obviously haven't seen what happens to the people who are. We see it all the time. They mess up people for life if they survive, but most don't anyway. Story 5. I occasionally work on the weekends for a funeral home. It's decent money for what it is, essentially 2 hours of call-out work when their normal staff is off. So last year, I was called in at around 5 in the morning. A 30-something-year-old guy had ended himself in a pretty small 2-bedroom apartment. That wasn't the bizarre part at all, since I've seen it before on callouts. What was bizarre was what was in the apartment. Thousands of documents piled on the floor, on a desk, on shelves of people's financial information. Credit card statements, bank statements, personal data, etc. There are probably 3,000 folders with all this stuff in them. Even where there weren't piles of folders, there were just loose papers, magnetic cards, and surveillance cameras. It was just the weirdest thing I've ever seen. And of course, some of these documents and folders had stains splattered all over them. It didn't matter to me, though, since the detective on scene had said it was fine to take the body. The police had to clear a path by collecting the papers from the route we would take from the door to the apartment to where he was. A couple of months later, it came out that the guy had over $2 million in cash and Bitcoin. Apparently, the state police were onto him. Now, this story reminds me of that Twilight Zone episode where the guy keeps files on everyone and judges them. If you think this dude's demise is a little odd, then you should probably check out what happens to the guy in Story 8. Story 6. I used to work in forensics, picking up decedents as well as assisting the medical examiner in the conduct of the autopsy. Not necessarily cleaning up the scene, but I've seen a guy who, during some kind of psychotic break, completely his entire package, then injured himself. He did all of this with a cheap kitchen blade in his shower. Cause, exsanguination complicating transverse carotid and jugular severance. Manner, self-inflicted harm. I am reluctant to give details, but here is what I can offer. There was a call to a Section 8 development about a man down the hall acting extremely erratically. He had no known history of substance abuse and no diagnosed psychiatric illnesses. His mother, whom he lived with, as well as many of the neighbors, called 911 multiple times, and the first responders were allegedly taking their sweet time getting to the scene. He lured his mother out into the hallway and then ran back into the apartment alone, locking the door behind him. He then ran to the kitchen, grabbed the blade, went and turned the shower on, and did what he did. He was picked up by EMSs and brought to a local hospital where he was pronounced DOA due to his injuries. No preliminary toxicology was conducted by the hospital. His remains were then picked up by us for examination. Unfortunately for the conclusion of the story, this happened on one of my last days of work after I already put in my 2 weeks' notice. Thus, I don't have access to the post-mortem toxicology report to find out why he did it. If the tox is negative for illicit substances, we may and will likely never know why he did it. I hypothesize that he suffered from some form of developmental disorder and, combined with a latent psychiatric illness of some sort, compounded with an unresolved body or gender dysmorphia complex, was unable to cope with his feelings and just broke down. Story 7. The entire residence was absolutely tossed as if someone was looking for something. However, this wouldn't end up being a typical robbery turned homicide. This was about to be way more bizarre. We get the man into the bag so the crime scene can take their photos. In the nearby toilet, we discover even more hemoglobin, possibly up to at least a third of this gentleman's entire volume in the john. It was just around that exact moment when another patrol officer was perusing around the residence when he started to find random objects covered in crap. Eventually, he found more objects with a mix of crap and hemoglobin. It then hit us just exactly what we were dealing with: extreme sensual acts with foreign objects. Most of the objects were quote-unquote reasonable, I suppose, smaller objects resembling the phallic shape, TV remotes, and things of that kind. At the autopsy, the findings were obvious. However, what I had to do was something I'll never forget. After the primary evisceration was complete, the doctor wanted to completely excise the so I had to don a chainmail glove and, after rolling this poor guy onto his side, press inside his abdominal cavity so the doctor could pull it taut enough to cut it out. We then cut lengthwise up to unfold the tissue into a large rectangle to see the extent of the internal lacerations. Needless to say, it's deep, extensive, and numerous. The assailants had been apprehended. So that's the story about how I had to cut out a guy's poop for science, medicine, and law. Story 8. A friend of mine works as a detective for homicides and vices, and sometimes the two combine. Usually she doesn't talk about work, ever, but she was suffering from this one scene. She described the following. Imagine a small apartment, one bedroom, one separate kitchen, a small living room, a small bathroom, and a tiny toilet. You enter the small hallway and you find a trail of hemoglobin. You follow the trail, and at the end of the trail is someone out of the living room window. She apparently tried to end herself by but it didn't stick, and she decided to jump out of her window but passed away before she could fall down. You keep exploring the scene, and in the bedroom, her 2 other children were found. They were older, a boy and a girl. So where is the father? Is he a potential suspect? Can we find anyone who knows where he is? Let's tag and bag the scene, consider him a suspect for now, and put out a warrant for his arrest or whatever kind of come with us innocent until proven guilty person arrest there is. Then the father steps out of the elevator outside the front door of his apartment. He looks at the open door with brand cards rolling out with the covered bodies of his children and wife. He looks at the police presence and the detectives in white suits. The hysterically crying man is having a meltdown of astronomical proportions, and my friend was there to see it all unfold in front of her eyes in the span of one afternoon. The guy was innocent. The cops opened the door and saw that it wasn't their type of scene. Now, my friend has seen self-inflicted injuries of all kinds. She's seen all types of necrosis. She's seen it all, but not a happy family going from heaven to the deepest depths of hell in the span of one afternoon. She's been on paid leave for a few weeks now. It was just simply too much for her. I have no idea how people can do that job for several decades. It wasn't a happy family from heaven if the mother had not slept in days. And if these kinds of disturbing videos keep you awake at night, how about liking this one and subscribing to my channel to keep watching the same kinds of videos? I have a lot more that'll keep you awake, and it really does help my channel. Thank you. Story 9. I clean up biohazard material for my company on occasion because I'm one of the only 2 that's certified. Me and my coworker went into a house to clean, but the boss failed to mention that they had been gone for 2 weeks. Okay, whatever, I can deal with that. So we walk into the house, and not only could you smell it from the start of the driveway, but all the windows were black. Okay, this dude had blackout curtains. I understand that. So we suited up and went into the house, which was relatively clean given the circumstances. We knew he passed away in the bathroom, so we made our way upstairs and followed the flies. So, you know how flies swarm bad things? Yeah, it wasn't blackout curtains in the bathroom. The windows were caked in with so many flies that sunlight just couldn't come in. My boss also failed to mention that he passed away in the bathtub. You hear about bloating and blah blah blah, but do you know what happens when a body sits in a bathtub for 2 weeks and soaks up all that water? It explodes. There was no water in the bathtub, just this sickly pink-colored stew. That was the most disgusting cleanup I've done by far. I can't even imagine what it sounded like when that happened. Story 10. I was dispatched to a vehicle versus pedestrian call a couple of months ago, and when we arrived on the scene, it was something like out of a movie. The dude was running across a fairly busy 4-lane road when he was hit by a car traveling about 55 miles per hour. After he was hit, he was thrown into the opposite lane and was by another vehicle, to say the least. Story 11. The craziest thing I ever heard as an EMT in training was cops and EMTs responding to a GSW, a gunshot wound. Cops, where I live, have to clear the scene first before medical personnel can go in. 2 boys were scared, hiding under their beds after witnessing it. Medics where I live are legally required to check for a pulse. As one does and the other, they are tandem, calls it in. Said body stands up and sits back down. Then it does it 2 more times. The last one puts its hands out like Frankenstein. Keep in mind that there is nothing from the jawline up. The second officer said, if he did it 1 more time, I'm him. As morbid as it is, I laughed at that part. Story 12. Oh boy, this one brings back memories. I was on my way with one of the detectives since they said there was no need to take my car. After they finished making a few assumptions about what happened, they let me clean up. I looked and saw a man in his birthday suit holding a fork inside an outlet with a metal chain around his neck. The best guess was that it was self-inflicted harm, but I will never forget the smell of electrocuted flesh. Hey, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you made it this far, I'm sure you're also going to enjoy what's the strangest thing you've seen inside someone's home. Story 5 is so weird. I'll see you in that video, and thank you for watching this one.